First of all, I want to welcome you to New York University and the Center for the Study of Transformative Lives. I'm Ulrich Baer. I'm Vice Provost for Faculty, Arts, Humanities, and Diversity. I'm also a professor of comparative literature, and I try to facilitate and help our institutes and centers. So the Center for Transformative Lives is a really interdisciplinary institute that spans many different areas and tries to understand what makes a life transformative in the ways in which that life itself has been transformed, in which lives can also inspire us to be transformed and to find not necessarily inspiration in the kind of simplistic way, but maybe a kind of an appeal to reflect and think about our own lives. And I want to say 2 or 3 words. I'll let Philip Kuhnhardt speak after me and say a little bit more about the center. And why I'm standing here right now is not merely in an administrative capacity, but I've been deeply engaged with Hannah Arendt's work for a long time, and I wanted to say something about that, how I came to actually read her work. And Anne just said many of us came to read Hannah Arendt in college. But for some, her work gained a certain kind of significance or importance. So I just wanted to say 2 things, so bear with me. It'll take 3 minutes or so. So in August 1962, and March 1962, Hannah Arendt had a very serious accident in Central Park. And she was in a taxi, and she was seriously injured and unconscious and taken to a hospital. And then when she woke up out of her coma, she did what a good German-trained philosopher does. She counted backwards from 20. She recited German poetry that she had memorized as a child to test her memory. And then she recapitulated in her mind who she was decade by decade. So she went in her head through her experience of growing up, born as a little Jewish girl, growing up in Königsberg, which today, of course, is Poland, where Immanuel Kant was also born some 150 years prior. Growing up, going to school, being a rather lonely girl, very studious, precocious, very smart. Then eventually enrolling in university in Marburg and Tübingen, studying philosophy, feeling very inspired and connected to some of her teachers, having a lifelong affair with her teacher, Martin Heidegger, who was at that point a junior professor of philosophy, really. Then expanding her horizons, moving to Paris when the Nazis came to power in Germany, working in a Zionist youth movement, helping kids basically move to what was then still Palestine, British Protectorate, and then being arrested and deported to one of the women's camps run by the Nazis in the south of France, and barely escaping. Like so many who couldn't escape, she was able to escape via Marseille and then Lisbon to the United States, where she became a citizen, and then very quickly, not as quickly, very quickly in some cases, but it took her years to achieve what she then considered her life's calling, is to participate in the public life of people by thinking and sharing her thinking through her writing and her teaching. She wrote a book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which made her very famous very quickly. Then in the 50s participated in debates that ultimately would prove to be very complicated. She participated in a very polemical debate about the integration of schools in the American South after Brown versus Board of Education, where, in my view, she was utterly wrong and on the wrong side of history. And she had very good reasons, she thought, for being on a side of history that ultimately people would fault her for. Then in the late 50s, she published more and more, was really one of the leading intellectuals in America. I know that at Barnard College in 1962, the freshman reading that summer was an essay by Hannah Arendt, was assigned to all the incoming women who were studying there at that moment. So she had the kind of prominence. And then it's 1962, and she has this accident, so she's recapitulated those decades of her life. This is prior to everything else that happens afterwards. Many of you know her from Eichmann and Discussion, which gained her a huge amount of enemies, and really overshadowed the rest of her life because she became such a polarizing figure for many people by analyzing the trial of Adolf Eichmann and Discussion, which she considered, for many reasons, inadequate or inappropriate. And then she wrote to Mary McCarthy later on when she woke up out of a coma in the hospital, and she said, "The most important thing was that for a fleeting moment, I had this feeling that it was within my own power to decide whether I wanted to live or to die. And although I did not think that death is something terrible, I also thought life is kind of nice. and I'd rather decide to live. And I thought about this quote, how Hannah Arendt, because Anne will talk about this today, made decisions, and what kind of decision that is to wake up out of a coma and be in this kind of hovering state of not quite feeling conscious yet and not quite feeling safe, but not being afraid of death. And it became a trademark to be a somewhat dispassionate analyst of situations of life and death that gained her a lot of respect, and also gained her a lot of enemies because she seemed sometimes too dispassionate in her analysis. But I thought about this quote yesterday and today when I was preparing to introduce Angela today, and then to sort of introduce you to what Arendt's life and work can mean to somebody. Because I was in this building after 9/11 on one of the floors, on the fourth floor actually, where you could still see the smoke from the ruins of the towers. And I edited a book after 9/11. I was working, but I really wasn't working. I was just actually sitting in this office looking out the window mostly. And then I picked up On Revolution by Hannah Arendt, which she wrote in 1964, which is a really surprisingly patriotic book. And it's an incredibly pro-American book. And it talks about the French and the American Revolution. It's very, very, very committed to the ideals of America, and very unapologetically defensive for somebody who's usually in the camp of very liberal critical thinkers. And for some reason, that book really was important for me at that moment, because I was sitting here looking at what was no longer there, down there, these towers. And Arendt had always been committed to living a life where you think very hard and unflinchingly about how to make sense of the world without ever retreating from the world into that mode of thinking and sitting in a study or in a tower, but actually to be fully engaged in the world and to realize that your life is made up of thought and of action both. That her immersion in the world, her engagement with the world, was for her as important as thinking about the world. That this kind of, what people have called, with Hannah Arendt giving the title of one of her books, her love for the world, this immersion in the social network that we all are, that we constitute through our actions and inactions, through our connections and lack of connections, that these networks are what the world is made up of and how the world is continually renewed through these kinds of actions. For me, that was very important after 9/11 to find a book that committed to the ideals of America, unapologetically, without shrinking away from trying to do the hard work of the analysis of what just happened. And I thought about this because I happened to have been in Paris for the last 5 days, completely coincidentally, like everybody else who was in Paris completely coincidentally. No one was in Paris for a purpose, for a reason. So people have asked me, did you go there? I said, no, I happened to have been in Paris. And I'm fine, and you're fine, but you're not quite fine. And I saw a little too much. I'd seen too much at 9/11. And I thought, what book do you turn to? Where do you turn to when you need this kind of unflinching analysis right now of what the world can be for us, how we create a world where people can actually live together in connection and disconnection? Hannah Arendt always emphasized that the world is not only made up of people being connected, but the world is also made up of people who are not connected. That is part of who we are. So it's not a kind of simplistic sociality of everybody feels the common thing, but not to feel something in common is a way of being in relation to other people. So I thought about this, what text by Hannah Arendt, and I couldn't come up with one, so I only read this letter where she decided you'd rather live, which is not granted to everybody. And in Paris, it was really, it's quite devastating to see a city in mourning. And so I thought, it was a way to introduce you to say, what can a book and what can a work do for people? It can provide sustenance. It can provide a vision of hope that is temporary, ephemeral, will not last, and that is yet worth pursuing. Hannah Arendt never gave us a comprehensive view of the world, but said there are things to hold on to and to defend. And the reason why I wanted to return to her and why I had read On Revolution, which was really a defense of American values, was that what we're seeing, I think, and I'm really not in a place or in a position to explain this, is a need to take stock of which values and ideals are worth defending, and which ones can we compromise on, and which ones are universally applicable, and which ones are just particular to certain places in the world, and they cannot be shared by everybody. So I thought her work is an inroad into this kind of effort right now, and at the same time, as you can see, the dispassionate part of Arendt's analysis is not always so easy to maintain. So I just wanted to open this, and I I really want to thank Anne and Phil for inviting me. I edited a book on Arendt 2 years ago with 11 people contributing essays examining the kind of shortcomings in her work and also the kind of gifts she's given us. So the center, as I said, is dedicated to this kind of analysis of how we can take stock of who we are, which I believe I don't need to remind anyone, at least for myself, this is what's urgently needed in the world today. So I want to thank Phil for running the center, and then he can introduce Anne, and then we'll have Anne talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion and conversation, and then we'll invite you for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Uli. That was marvelous. I am so lucky to work at NYU and have Ulrich Baer as my oversight here. As he said, he's responsible for many of the centers and institutes at NYU and their work, and he's been a great ally of mine, and I am very grateful. So thank you. Earlier this year, I was lucky to receive an advance copy of Anne Heller's book. I'd become interested in Hannah Arendt over the past few years and was reading her letters to and from her longtime friend, Karl Jaspers. And with the refugee crisis today, and I think I was so glad Uli spoke about his experience in Paris, but with the refugee crisis that we're all facing in the world today, which has been called the most profound since World War II, there is a sense of history closing again and a kind of intimacy with the period of Arendt that is quite striking. One of Arendt's most affecting essay was titled "We Refugees," and she, having, as Uli said, having escaped the Nazi terror by fleeing across Europe, eventually to the United States. And her relevance is ongoing in so many ways. Just this morning, my wife Margie told me she was listening to the Brian Lehrer show and on WNYC, and he mentioned Hannah Arendt in connection with the ISIS attacks in Paris. And he was talking about the appeal of the terrorist groups to young, rootless men. And he brought up her famous phrase, the banality of evil. That there's this romance, that this is a great, exciting thing to join in. It's going to bring meaning to your life. But in fact, in her view, evil is shallow. It's rootless. It spreads like a fungus. And it's even scarier because of that. In any case, I found Anne's book, reading it this summer, to be a model of clarity. By the way, we're going to be selling it after this event, and Anne will be signing books for anyone who'd like to have one. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, especially given the contentious and complex nature of the subject. I really appreciated the clarity. It's a book in a series of short lives, in the Icon series, that was commissioned and edited by the well-known publisher and author, biographer James Atlas, who is here with us tonight. I'm very pleased. And I'm going to call on him for a question later. And because of being part of this short series, the book has the virtue of compression. Elizabeth Young Bruhl's superb full biography of Hannah Arendt, For the Love of the World, runs to 500 pages. Anne had to accomplish hers in 134. And in addition to providing an overall treatment of Arendt's life and surveying the important work of others, Anne brings to her story her own unique sensibilities. I think you'll see that. Reviewers have called her book lucid and accessible, concise yet sweeping, finely detailed, clear-eyed, and sympathetic. And I might add also that it is insightful, humane, beautifully written, and in the end, deeply moving. The story of one of the great teachers of her age, who was a voice of humanism, reason, and inclusion. Which is not to say she was perfect. And Anne doesn't fail to neglect her brusqueness, sometimes arrogance, and some of her major errors of judgment. and humbly refers to her book as a brief introduction to the story, and a way for new students of Arendt to begin their exposure to her and her work. And with this in mind, I decided to invite Anne to be with us here tonight to introduce us as an audience to the life of an extraordinary human being, an intellectual and moral force who, as she herself recognized, lived through one of the worst horrors of the 20th century. In the course of reading Anne's book, I realized that I knew one of Hannah Arendt's close associates, the philosopher William Barrett. A younger colleague of Arendt's and part of her circle in New York City from the 1940s onward, Barrett wrote a marvelous book on existentialism I read many years ago entitled Irrational Man. Maybe you know it. He would go on later to write a memoir which described his years with Arendt and other intellectuals in New York, the truants. I got to know him back in the mid-1980s when he was an older man and teaching part-time at Pace University. And he was working on a book called The Death of the Soul. Though I was working at that time long hours and helping raise a young family, in my mid-30s, I decided to audit his night course in philosophy. And I was often invited by him after class to join him and a few of his students at his favorite restaurant nearby for more conversation. And I can tell you he was a person of great personal presence, both intellectual and emotional, and his impact on me was extraordinary. And remembering that as I prepared for tonight made me feel closer to Hannah Arendt. And one more personal connection before I introduce our guest. Before I came to NYU, I taught briefly at Bard College, where I became aware of their highly prized Bard or Hannah Arendt Center. It exists there partly because Arendt's husband, Heinrich Blücher, taught on the Bard faculty for many years with great success and impact, and where both he and Hannah are buried. One of Arendt's most forceful books came 6 years after the infamous Eichmann trial and was titled Men in Dark Times, a treatment of men and women of humanity and courage living through extraordinarily difficult days. Among them, she included Pope John the 23rd, Isaac Dinesen, Rosa Luxemburg, Bertolt Brecht, Randall Jarrell, and her own mentor and dear friend, her antidote to Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers. Since my center focuses on lives of moral courage and creative thought, I feel another reason for kinship with our study tonight. Anne Heller gives Arendt a high compliment by titling her book, Hannah Arendt, A Life in Dark Times. Anne is an independent scholar and author who lives in New York City. She was the fiction editor at Esquire magazine, the executive editor of the magazine development group at Condé Nast Publications. She's the author of a full-length biography, Ayn Rand and the World She Made, quite a different subject from the one we'll be speaking about tonight. And though she and I have known each other for, I was just looking back, about a year and a half, let me say I count her as a wonderful new friend. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Anne C. Heller.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Ulrich. I'm so pleased to be here tonight. I feel I have nothing left to say after those wonderful, so we can just go to questions. Hannah Arendt once wrote that even in the darkest times, we have the right to expect some illumination. And she herself provided much illumination in the darkest times out of her fertile concern with the world she lived in. She brought forth so many new ideas and piercing insights that it's difficult to sum up her contributions in a few sentences, which I don't have to do because others have done that before me. But she's still best known, perhaps, for her monumental exploration of the forces that culminated in the Nazi horrors, the death camps, and the Stalinist purges, in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which, as I think Philip mentioned, or perhaps Ulrich, was her first book-length work of political theory, and her first work in English. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. And one thing she does have in common with Ayn Rand is that she, by pure force of determination, mastered the English language to the degree that she could express what she wanted to express. Much more complex, of course, than Ayn Rand's mission, but nonetheless, they have that in common. Exiles who came to write in English. In The Human Condition, which was published 7 years later, she gave a very complex and provocative and subtle description of the history of Western traditions, which had brought us into a rather darkened modern world. And in essays and books later, both earlier and later than that, she reflected on the nature of being a refugee. Some of her most beautiful work is about the dilemmas of the refugee in a strange land, often unwanted. She certainly felt unwanted here at first. And on the nature of political action and human freedom, the qualities of individual men and women that offer hope. And she gave us new ways of thinking about the ever-recurring problems of willful human evil, political freedom, and the receding foundations of moral and political authority in the Western world. She wrote in the preface to The Human Condition that her mission for that book, which invites us to sit by her side as she rethinks the history of Western traditions from Socrates to Marx, was nothing more than to think what we are doing. When she wrote that phrase, she described her own strongest drive and her most enduring achievements. Thanks to her, we know some of the sources of the overweening brutality and inhumanity she came to call radical evil, describing the Nazi death camps. A new phenomenon, she told us, and also some of the fearsome dangers of small-minded motives going along and wanting to say we, that allow for another kind of evil, the banality of evil, to spread across a land. Hannah Arendt thought alone, but not because she was a social loner. Friendlessness was not known to her. She had a gift for friendship. And one of the chief objectionable qualities she found in Adolf Eichmann was that he was a man in the midst of communal disintegration and social atomization, like the other Nazi underlings, who wanted to belong at any price, as she wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism. She had friends galore, including Robert Lowell and Paul Tillich, Mary McCarthy, and Hans Morgenthau, and some of the other people you've heard mentioned here tonight. It wasn't because she was an outsider in thinking, but because she reacted with originality, brilliance, and without any self-pity that I've been able to detect to the events of her own life and history that she's given us the extraordinary works that she did. I thought tonight, because I'm a biographer and not a social theorist, that I would describe 3 formative events in Hannah Arendt's life and her responses to them, hoping to provide a window into how she became what she herself called, admiringly of others, a conscious pariah, which was the working title for my book, and a champion of thinking what we are doing under the crushing weight of history. I'll end with a description of that stark crisis of her later life, the aftermath of the publication of her book, Eichmann and Jerusalem, a book that every week I see fiercely debated, almost as fiercely now as it was 50 years ago when it was published. It is a touchstone of, it touches a nerve that won't stop vibrating. The first event I wanted to talk about was the death of her father. She was born near Hanover, Germany, in central Germany, but she grew up in the somewhat fairy tale city of Königsberg, which was cross-hatched by canals and filled with castles. It sits on what used to be the eastern edge of Germany on the Baltic coast. It's now a military base in Russia after the Second World War. It was part of what was considered Russian territory. It had a long-standing and very well-assimilated Jewish population, and her own parents were very well assimilated into the society of Königsberg. They'd both been born and raised there, and as had three out of four of Arendt's grandparents. Her father was an engineer and was a graduate of the city's German university. Her mother was a musician who had trained in Paris before returning home to marry her father, Paul. Hannah was an only child, and the family moved from Hanover back to Königsberg in 1909 when she was a child of 2.5 because her father had been re-diagnosed with syphilis, and he was in an advanced stage of the disease. He had contracted the then incurable disease before his marriage. His wife knew about it, and they thought that because the symptoms had disappeared and he'd been treated with the cutting-edge treatment of that time, the induction of malarial fever is how they cured syphilis, that it had gone for good. But when Hannah was a toddler, it came back, and it began to advance rapidly. The symptoms, which were, progressively horrendous. First weakness, then loss of balance, then seizures, then disfiguring tumors, paralysis, mania, insanity, and death, meant that early on he couldn't work and needed the support of his family in Königsberg and the services of the university hospital there. He lived until Arendt was 7 years old. She spent almost every day with him, first at home and then in the psychiatric hospital to which he was dispatched when he couldn't be cared for at home. And she spent every day with him until he could no longer recognize her. When he died, her mother wrote in a journal, "She takes her father's death to be something sad for me. She herself remains untouched by it." This was, for me, this was a very surprising remark by a 7-year-old girl. And I pondered it long. What could it mean? And then as I studied her more, I found that she appeared to be dispassionate and untouched by many things that she had been touched deeply by. Of course, she wasn't untouched by her father's death. In a life of displacements, which were to come, his illness and death were the reasons for both her first and her second displacements. The first being the move to Königsberg, and the second being the remarriage of her mother some years later for financial security to a man who Arendt felt what she called, in another context, intense disdain for. He was an ironmonger, and I guess he was a German patriarch who insisted on his way. She was used to her freedom by that time. But in the next few years before the remarriage, Arendt was often sick, perhaps somewhat hypochondriacally, especially whenever her mother left her to travel. She would get sick. A child should not be separated from her mother, she told her mother when she was 4 years old. Her mother duly noted that in her journal. Every 6 months she had to have tests for congenital syphilis, and in a child who was already known for her intellectual precocity, that must have been terrifying. Perhaps most characteristic and crucial was her response to whatever shame the family suffered as a result of what was then known as a pariah's disease, in which, in the small setting of Königsberg, was seen by everyone who saw Paul Arendt on the streets and known by those who didn't see him. She felt, she said at age 18, an early sense of being ostracized. And yet for her, who never talked about her father's death to anyone perhaps except her husband, Heinrich Blücher, early suffering, I came to see, gradually yielded powerful traits: self-reliance, defiance, aggressive pride, and what her friend Hans Jonas called a know-it-all attitude under stress, which she certainly exhibited in the aftermath of Eichmann and Jerusalem. Later, in an essay on Isaac Dinesen, she extolled the art of storytelling as a healer of pain, but she never told the story of her father, even to her closest friends. Instead, she told other people's stories, especially the stories of the dislocated, rootless ones with whom she deeply identified, but yet from whom she also stood apart. Two strains in her writing that would clash most fatefully when she came to write about Adolf Eichmann. The second move took place when her mother remarried. She said at that time that she felt like a stranger. She had a few adolescent rebellious moments of a personal nature, and then, characteristically again, rebelling against dull pain, she settled down at age 13 into the serious study of Greek, Latin, ancient philosophy, German poetry, Kierkegaard, and other Christian theologians. In that episode of her childhood, I find her willingness to embrace what is and to defy anybody else's definition of what that might mean. The second event I'd like to talk about is her love affair with Martin Heidegger, which is probably, after Eichmann and Jerusalem and maybe the origins of totalitarianism, the thing that she's now best known for, although it didn't, nobody knew about it at the time of her death or until many years after her death, when a trove of letters was discovered in an archive in Germany, and it became clear that they had a torrid affair. She was 18 years old. She was spiritually intense and beautiful. She was both self-assured and shy. Her friend Hans Jonas, who she met in her first year at Marburg, said she had an intensity, an inner direction, an instinct for quality, a groping for essence, a probing for death, which cast a magic about her. One felt an absolute determination to be herself, with the toughness to carry it through in the face of great vulnerability. And yet, almost immediately, she developed what she herself described as an unbending devotion to a single one in the first course she took with philosophy professor Martin Heidegger, who then was 35 years old. He was the married father of 2 sons and was just on the verge of completing Being and Time, his masterwork, or so many people think. His students who worshipped him called him the little magician from Meßkirch. That's where he was born. Hannah called him the hidden king who reigned in the realm of thinking. On his 80th birthday, that's what she wrote about him. He taught her to think, she said, and that may have been the highest tribute she could pay to anyone. What and how did he teach her to think? I don't know, because I'm not much of a Heidegger scholar, although I tried to master the key elements of his philosophy as I was writing this book. He did teach her to deconstruct ideas until the received concepts which form them and hold them together vanish into air and only phenomena remain. And then to rebuild and restring them into new forms and new instruments. He trained her to look at what was new in the ancient traditions and what was unprecedented in the present moment. He taught her to value thinking itself and to value the idea of thinking. He may also have taught her to affirm her Germanness. He was a very devoted German. And he did that just at the moment of coming peril, just in the mid-1920s, as Hitler was released from containment and began to travel the country and raise a hue and cry. And possibly at the same time to subdue whatever she may have wished to embrace about her own Jewish roots. Heidegger was a German romantic. He was a believer in blood and soil. He wore lederhosen and and Black Forest coats, and he was proud of his ancient Black Forest peasant ancestry. She once wrote him a letter expressing an inner sense of being shadowed, being a stranger, being an outsider. And he responded immediately with a warning. "I would not love you if I were not convinced that those shadows are not you," he wrote, "but distortions and illusions produced by an endless self-erosion that penetrated from outside." It's hard to believe that in the context in which they were living, they weren't subtextually talking about her Jewishness. The love affair, which lasted for 3 years and took place all over the place, hidden, ended when the professor was made chairman of the philosophy department at Freiburg, and at the exact time that Hitler began to amass power. The last time Hannah saw Martin Heidegger, before she fled Germany, was in 1929, when he paid a visit to her and her first husband. They were newly married. I think they'd been married 3 days, and he came to visit, disrupting everything, as he liked to do, I guess. And at the end of the visit, her husband, Gunther Stern, went with Heidegger to the train station. They were taking the same train together by coincidence, and she stood on the platform and waved goodbye. Neither man noticed her waving. The men were talking to each other. The next day, she wrote to Heidegger describing the diabolical clarity with which she saw him glance at her and glance away without recognizing her. How easily he forgot her, she said. She recalled a scene from her early childhood at the time when her father was losing his mind, and her mother, acting out an episode from a fairy tale, pretended that her daughter's nose had grown so long that the mother didn't know the daughter. "I kept crying, but I am your child, I am your Hannah." That's what it was like today, she wrote to Heidegger. Unknown to her, Heidegger was already corresponding with Nazi officials and angling for a position, an education position, in any coming government run by the Nazis. In 1933, he became the rector of Freiburg and joined the Nazi Party, and he commenced to ostracize and or forcibly retire Jewish colleagues who he'd worked with for many years, and who gradually, some of them, disappeared into exile or into concentration camps. He delivered public speeches about German authenticity, and throughout the 40s he privately enlarged his concept of being to include the notion of being in the world, a core element of his thinking, which means to be rooted in the soil of a nation to which some people belong by virtue of ancestry and language, and others do not. In her mature work, Arendt fiercely affirmed that being alive means being somewhere. But by then she well understood the menace of peoples and nation states founded on blood and soil. Nevertheless, she resumed her friendship with Heidegger after the war, and she became his chief advocate in America, arranging for the publication of his works, arranging for translations, constantly scrounging to get him money. Yet she was very bitter in the 1930s and 40s against Heidegger and people like him. And her experience taught her that in a disintegrating social order, such as the one that existed in Germany, and one might say such as the one that exists in parts of the world today, a totalitarian ideology appeals not only to the mob, to the uneducated, to the thoughtless, but also to the elite. Both long for the destruction of the failed hidebound bourgeois order that binds us, although for different reasons. And ironically, both become entirely dispensable as soon as they stop being useful to the totalitarian masterminds. Heidegger himself lasted only a year as rector of Freiburg. He understood that the Nazis really had no use for his ideas, and they had no intention of adopting them, but they liked him as a figurehead for a while. The third event was the assumption of power by Hitler and the Nazi Party in the winter and spring of 1933. Arendt left Nazi Germany in the summer of 1933, soon after Hitler came to power. She was arrested by the very new German political police, and she got a policeman who really didn't know what he was doing. He'd been an ordinary policeman on the beat, and he was young, and he let her go, and she understood that she was doing research for a Zionist organization. She understood that she was going to be in deep trouble if she ever let herself be caught again. So she escaped through Switzerland to France and became officially stateless. She left without a passport or a visa. And was stateless from 1933 until she became a U.S. citizen in 1951. She said she did not intend to run around Germany as a second-class citizen. And in this she was prescient because many people stayed. They thought Hitler was one in a series of anti-Semites, violent anti-Semites who would, fade away as time went on, and they were wrong. She said then and always, if one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend oneself as a Jew. And this was a major change in her thinking and grew out of some of the qualities of defiance and clear thinking and standing alone and apart and thinking things through that she developed early on, and it may have been part of her native character. She asked herself, what specifically can I do as a Jew? And she began to work for Jewish resettlement organizations in Paris. And I wonder if I could get some more.
Let me help you with that.
Thank you. And to begin her course of reading, everything that she could find, including Marx, that allowed her eventually to write The Origins of Totalitarianism. She said she quickly saw, relevant today, that stateless persons have no rights. The rights of man do not apply. Who is to enforce them? They're without rights, without a state. And that is something that we should all keep in mind today. She became a political thinker at that time, at the moment that she realized that belonging to Judaism, as she said, became my own problem, and that problem was political. Germany had, when she was growing up, had been the best place in the world for Jews to live and thrive. And it was a massive shock that she absorbed and began to think about very rapidly, and gave us enormous insights into. One thing, when she was working on the origins of totalitarianism and asking herself what happened in her Germany, the Germany she had grown up in, which seemed so safe that her parents never even wondered what the limitations were on what she could become. She could become anything. And not so many years later, she couldn't be allowed to live. So what had happened there? She asked herself. And what she answered was to find what was new about the Nazis that was different from all the previous anti-Semitic uprisings of Europe. The Nazis, she wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, didn't only wish to punish Jews, or even to kill Jews, or even to rid the world of Jews. The Nazis wanted to make all men interchangeable, basically Jews, rootless, superfluous even to themselves, so that they wouldn't care about their own lives. They created a world in which everything was possible, she wrote, and nothing was true, a nightmare of a world. It was a monumental insight into the drive toward total power for total domination that she also saw in bits and pieces in other cultures and other places. She was afterward often accused of clinging to her assimilated German values and to the German language and the high culture of her youth. She yet deeply preferred what she called the pariah virtues at this period, that come with being internally free to be an outsider and refuse to wear a mask or climb a ladder. She identified them as heart, humanity, humor, disinterested intelligence, kindness, freedom from prejudice, and sensitiveness to injustice. This insight into evil, total evil, the evil of making men superfluous to each other and themselves, was one of the things that her accusers, after Eichmann in Jerusalem was published, faulted her for. They said that with the banality of evil, she had betrayed this powerful insight that she had had into the nature of the Nazi horror. And she became an outcast again later in life. It launched the most painful period of her later years, and yet even here Heidegger's influence can be seen. For Heidegger taught Arendt to detest thoughtlessness, which is what she accused Eichmann of, being unable to think, which he called the endless chattering and calculation of modernity that always destroys deep, authentic thought. Hannah thought not, but she thought not. She thought it could not destroy thought. In the end, her definition of freedom grew out of her definition of thinking as thinking with myself, and was rooted in her experiences of reversal and loss, of dislocation and loneliness. She located human freedom in our ability to sustain plurality, the plurality of individuals, to act in concert, together, out of individual conscience for the future, to create something new from the husk of the old, and to act as challengers, she wrote, to create a public space between ourselves where freedom can appear. I think that'll be all for now. If we talk about Eichmann, maybe we can talk about it in questions.
Thank you, first of all, and I thank you for summarizing a book that's really sort of a very concise account of a very complex life. And I thought I'd start out by asking, to follow up what you just said, that Arendt was accused of betraying something after the Eichmann book because people felt she had betrayed the memory of the dead, essentially, and she had spoken out of turn and not with the necessary compassion, empathy, and love that people thought was required when analyzing the vast crime of the Holocaust. But the betrayal for her was a kind of honesty that she thought when you think, you follow your thinking and you stay with the honesty of your thinking and you're not kind of deterred by these other things, in the three examples, you said she reversed herself in a certain way. She changed her attitude towards something. But there, people didn't forgive her because she did not go back. She actually kept on pushing towards something that people felt you should not have investigated. They think she went too far. So I'm kind of interested when you have these three turning points, which I guess is the structure of Steve Jobs, the movie by Aaron Sorkin or something, these three big events. So there are these three, they're turning points, and you say they actually became kind of her own touchstone for how to be honest with yourself. But then people accused her later in her life for not being honest enough, or by going too far with this kind of rigor, or this kind of, this side of her that was what you said. She learned in this encounter with Heidegger, then she learned in the encounter with what the Germans really had in mind, and this kind of vast betrayal of what you said, one of the greatest countries for Jews to live, that betrayed them so profoundly that her friend Gershom Scholem could never forgive, in a way, that this betrayal of having hosted people and then sort of made them feel suddenly they were just being hosted. So I'm curious of what you say, whether she actually was consistent at the end, or whether these reversals are part of what she felt was consistency, to follow through logically what you experienced.
Well, is this working? I should say probably a little bit about Eichmann in Jerusalem. I'm not sure everyone has read it, but in 1961, Hannah Arendt was invited to go to Jerusalem to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who had been captured a little more than a year previously in Argentina, where he had been hiding since the end of the war. And the Israelis kidnapped him and brought him to Israel, which was 12 years old at that time, and put him on trial after a long period of interrogation. There was a lot of controversy about this trial. Did Israel have the right to try Eichmann? He'd never lived there. What right did Israel have? The kidnapping was extra legal, if not illegal. I don't think there was a world court at that time. In fact, it was partly because of Hannah Arendt foresaw the need for a world court after Eichmann was tried, so that there wouldn't be these questions raised again. She went there wanting to see an example of the killers, the mass murderers that she had written about in Origins of Totalitarianism, but had left Germany too early to encounter herself, thank goodness. And what she found was a small man who was incapable of the kind of radical evil that she thought, that she had seen in studying what had happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And so she revised her idea about evil, not, I wouldn't say categorically, but added another dimension to it, which she called the banality of evil. And part of the reason she got into trouble with that book, which made her many, many enemies in the United States and Israel and all over the world, was because she seemed to be letting Eichmann off the hook. His motives, she said, were not criminal. They were merely middle class. He wanted to rise in the ranks. He was an example of the socially useless, economically disenfranchised, atomized, alienated modern man that she had written about, and he wanted to belong. So she wrote that one of the greatest crimes in history was made possible because people wanted to belong. And but what she wrote about Eichmann was sarcastic and somewhat sneering, belittling. She didn't take him seriously, it seemed, from the tone of her writing. But what she did take seriously, and what she spent perhaps too long in the book in writing about, was the culpability of the Jewish councils that Eichmann formed in the capitals of Europe to help Eichmann, rather more skillfully than you can believe an idiot that she thought Eichmann could be capable of, to help round up and transport Jews to their deaths. And the combination of those things, the seeming minimizing of Eichmann, and the long and very bitter indictment of the Jewish councils. I wish I could quote, I won't quote without being able to quote verbatim, but it's a bitter, bitter indictment. Caused people to say that Hannah Arendt was an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew, arrogant, on the side of the Germans in some vague way, and that she had abandoned her insight into radical evil, that will to totally dominate and crush the individuality, the value, and the sense of justice in every man, woman, and child. So do I think she changed her mind? I think this was a new analysis, and from all the things that we know about Eichmann now, and we know much more than Hannah Arendt did, it appears that he was much more much more motivated by anti-Semitism and hatred, and if not an actual drive to murder. He's not the sort of guy who would have stabbed his next door neighbor or throttled his wife, by a willingness to do just about anything to accomplish something that was fueled by hatred. So no, I don't think. I think that this was an addition to her insights about evil.
In Argentina, didn't Eichmann give interviews where he bragged about his murderous hatred of Jews? And she was unaware of this.
She wasn't entirely unaware of it. The opening paragraph in a 2-part article in Life magazine just before the Eichmann trial took place quoted him as saying many things, including, "I will jump into my grave a happy man because I've personally helped to murder 5 million Jews." She didn't believe him. She thought he was an idiot. I don't know what she thought motivated him to say that, but she did not believe that he had the depth of character, to have had that motive rise out of his own soul. And she also wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem is a fascinating book, and I recommend it to anybody who wants to read it. She also wrote about the way he spoke the German language, and how he couldn't say a single word without using a cliché. And you could ask him any number of questions trying to get around some issue that needed to be talked about, and he would repeat the same phrases over and over again. And she saw this kind of aphasia, whatever it might be, as a sign of shallowness and basic stupidity, the inability to think, thoughtlessness. That was her diagnosis of Eichmann. And I think now we know she was not entirely correct about that.
I think what she leaves us with, though, and Eichmann also quoted Immanuel Kant on the stand, which enraged her in a way that he quoted the philosopher who she then read for the rest of her life and taught many universities. What she leaves us with, I think, is that there had been an assumption that racism and prejudice and bigotry and this kind of hatred is not compatible with somebody who's really thinking about anything in the world, that it's a simplified reductive way of being in the world. And so she wanted to save thinking and say, thinking is the way out of this. And people who have these kinds of beliefs and act in this, they're not thinking people. So thinking for her was the refuge to stay in a place where there is a possibility out of this. Because if somebody who's actually thinking, quoting Kant, and gets a little bit of it right, then what is there to hold on to? And when she was accused of holding on to the tradition, which for her ultimately became the Greek tradition all the way to sort of German philosophy, idealist philosophy, this was for her something to hold on to, because if this wasn't defensible, if people could be educated and trained and speak in the way that sounds philosophical and still be full of racist bigotry and murderous hatred and act these things out, then what is there that we can hold on to? Then in some ways, what was she doing training people in America in the 1960s and engaging in debates, which were roiling in America at this point, a moment of incredible transformation? The 60s, she's teaching to students, and she goes to give lectures. Thousands of people come to listen to her because she's trying to say there is a way to get out of all these kinds of prejudiced, reductive ways of being in the world with others. So I think she leaves us with this question of how do you hold on to thinking as a defense against this kind of racist bigotry, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I wonder also back to the Jewish councils, the collaborators, the very what's that?
Very loaded word, collaborator.
Okay, well you use the right word, but the Judenrat, I think.
It's Arendt's word.
Yeah, but the sense of blaming the victim, the sense of why focus on the Jewish people that were sucked into the Nazi system? Did it have something to do with her insistence that every individual had the mandate to think for themselves, to make courageous actions, to stand up to authority, to fight back? And a kind of disdain for those who were weak enough to allow themselves to be used by this murderous system.
I think there was some of that. It's a mystery. It's a bit of a mystery, because one of the most beautiful passages I know, one of the most chilling and beautiful in the origins of totalitarianism, is about the victim who has to become a perpetrator, for whom there are no good choices, who is reduced to criminality. It's one of the chief theses of her analysis of how totalitarianism gains its ends, that it reduces everybody to a criminal status and that there is no way out. And it's an insight that did not seem to inform those pages of Eichmann in Jerusalem. In the course of writing about her, I felt that one of her greatest qualities, and perhaps a blind spot, was that she would not be a victim. And in writing about this period, as she did in Eichmann in Jerusalem, she couldn't quite allow herself to imagine that there were pure victims who had any power whatsoever. And some of these people had some power, but it was a power compromised by her earlier insight. So it remains a mystery to me why she was so ferocious on that subject. It's something she's still not forgiven for today.
She speaks a bit about the role of empathy. You write about this. I saw a documentary film about Poles living near Auschwitz, and there was a farmer, an older man who was interviewed who had lived through this era, and they knew what was going on behind those walls, and he was asked whether he was devastated by knowing this and living by it, and he said, no, not at all. And he said, what do you mean, not at all? He said, well, if I cut my finger, it hurts, but if somebody else cuts their finger, it doesn't hurt me. But this was the spooky idea that everybody's out for themselves, and if it's not in my backyard, it's not going to affect me.
Yeah, she wrote about thinking as being the two-in-one, thinking with oneself, but also being able to think from the other's point of view. It's a dialogue that takes place within the self, trying to absorb the other's point of view. And this was something she also wrote about in The Origins of Totalitarianism. She wrote about, this actually in an interview she gave, she was asked about this question, and she said that there's a perhaps apocryphal tale of a German farmer who was on the route of the Russian soldiers going back to Russia after World War II, and the Russians would stop and ask for something to eat, and he'd say, "There's some pig slop, you can have that." And the Russians would eat the pig slop because they were starving, and then the German would say, "There, you see, they're pigs." So it's the same thing. It's the inability to put yourself in another pair of shoes, and she thought she saw that in Adolf Eichmann.
Well, I want to add one thing, and if you can say something about this. So, as you pointed out, she made some errors. So, in the 50s, she spoke out very vehemently against school integration in the South because she felt school was a private matter and education should not be governed by the state in the way it was by Brown versus Board of Education. In 1965, she actually, probably one of the very few times, if not the only time in her life, recognized the error when Ralph Ellison wrote to her and in a public letter said, "You are utterly wrong because you do not understand that in this country, African American children are politicized long before they become citizens, properly speaking," because she had this idea that children should not be used in political processes because they're not fully capable of participating. And Ellison said, "You don't understand what American life is like because black children are politicized long before, and their parents actually have to arm them against the politicization of their daily lives, which are subjected to systematic racism. So when they go to school, they're not being used," and she thought they were being used to advance the parents' social goals, to put kids into better schools. So I'm going to send my black kid to a white school because it'll advance the kid and its social ambition, which she thought was utterly wrong to use children. She was corrected by Ellison. And it was a rare moment that actually someone corrected her, because there were hundreds and hundreds of people, as you said, very, very important thinkers, her closest friends, who said, "Can you explain yourself about Eichmann and correct yourself?" And she said, "No, absolutely not. I will not back away from this at all." She lost many friends over this. This is the one moment when Ellison wrote to her that she said, "I didn't understand what it means to grow up black in this country." And what you said, to understand someone else's point of view, didn't mean for her, I understand everything about them, but I also realize that I can't understand something about the other position, just like they can't understand something about me. So I was interested in this one moment and what you have to say about this, where she actually, which was a small consolation, because I hate to disappoint you, but then in the late 60s, she was a vehement opponent to black studies and to any kind of affirmative action or opportunity programs for African American students, because she felt it diminished the goals of the university. So she actually completely failed yet again in some people's books, including mine, as you know, because I did edit a book on her actually ultimately, so there's a book. But she had a moment when she felt there was something she hadn't grasped about what she really felt was, really one of the big problems of the 20th century, the color line in Du Bois's words, so racism. So could you say something about how you felt she approached this American problem, especially as a European who had become an American and brought all of her European philosophizing onto this continent?
Well, I can talk more about her own childhood. She said that that she didn't know she was a Jew until she began to go out into the streets and go to school. That her parents never talked about that. And that she was raised to, if anybody said anything to her in school, she was raised to defend herself, and that was that. And I think she may have brought some of that, the pride of that upbringing, into her understanding of what was going on in Little Rock, Arkansas. In the book on revolution that you mentioned, she makes a division between social aspirations in the French Revolution and purely political aspirations toward democratic freedom in the public forum in the American Revolution. And she was always aware of the difference between social aspirations and political aspirations. And in the case of Little Rock, I think she understood that she had confused the categories, that she hadn't gotten it right.
I promised we would open this conversation up to you, and I'd like to call on my friend Jim Atlas if you'd like to ask a question, Jim, and then a few others before
Make it easy, Jim.
It will be easy. Thank you.
We have a microphone coming down to you. I think it should work.
I have such a loud voice anyway. But now there's really nothing left to say. Now you've said it all. But it at least gives me the opportunity to thank Professor Baer for his startlingly eloquent and impassioned comments about Hannah Arendt within the context of the world we live in now, and Philip for being such a gracious and generous host and lending us the imprimatur of the Center for the Study of Transformative Lives, and Anne for pardon? Are people really not hearing me? I've said everything I have to say, but and Anne for writing the book. I did have actually one question though, and that was, you've intimated that there was, or said that there was a tremendous uproar after the publication of Eichmann, and I'd like to hear more about this in the specific realm of the New York intellectuals who had such a violent opposition to the book. Among them, Saul Bellow and Alfred Kazin and others. What was it exactly that made them so incensed?
There was a terrible uproar, and it was among the New York intellectuals. It was also Hannah Arendt went to teach at the University of Chicago in the fall after the publication of Eichmann in Jerusalem, and a student of hers who I interviewed for the book told me that she spent evening after evening sitting alone with no one dining with her in the faculty club. Israel sent emissaries to instruct rabbis across the nation to denounce her from their pulpits. She was afraid her husband Heinrich Blücher. It was an absolute debacle. Her husband Heinrich Blücher had a German communist past, and he had, smudged it over, colored it in, made it look a lot better when he applied for citizenship in the 1950s in the United States. And even in the early 1960s, it was not so long after the McCarthy period that they feared that he would be deported if Israel and other powerful enemies of this book made too big a fuss. She was utterly, uprooted and frightened and stubborn and stuck to her guns. But what caused it was her tone of voice in this book. She is so brilliant and so acid, she's just, her prose just burns holes in the paper it's written on, and she's clearly angry. But what is she angry about? And it was the anger that seemed to be directed at Israel. She makes terrible comments about the state of Israel, and particularly its prime minister at that time, David Ben-Gurion, and at the Jewish councils and at the conduct of the trial. She objected to the weeks of testimony by the survivors of the concentration and the death camps. She left and came back, and it seemed not sufficiently respectful of the terrible devastation that had taken place just 15 years before.
Somebody else have a question? Here in the front, there's a microphone for you.
To my mind, one of the measures of the longevity of the controversy about her was the fact that just a few years ago, there was a documentary film made about her. I don't know if did you see it, incidentally?
Are you thinking about the Margaret von Trotta? Are you thinking about the film about the Eichmann trial?
Yes, it was essentially about the Eichmann trial, and it was done at the Quad Theater here. It was one of the, it stood out for one, I was interested in the subject, but also I was only about one of three people in the audience.
Oh.
So I doubt if it was very much of a commercial success, but I was wondering if you had seen it and what you thought, what kind of impact it might have made on her image.
Oh, I think it was very warm to Hannah Arendt. I think it portrayed her as a misunderstood hero for the most part, and a valiant defender of her own values and her own work. I didn't see it as it tried to represent the controversy that surrounded the Eichmann trial, but I don't think that it stirred up. And certainly the people who wrote about it in the New York Review of Books and online and everywhere wrote about that film were ready to take on the controversy all over again.
And that was just 5 or 6 years ago.
When it add something to, I think it was maybe 4 years ago.
4 years,
and
very recent.
we actually had Margarete von Trotter, Barbara Sukowa, Pam Grier here at NYU and talked about the film. So you were there, and it was. You may be right that in America it wasn't the commercial success that, it's very hard to achieve with a foreign film, but it was fairly successful. Tony Scott in the New York Times called it a brilliant suspense thriller about the life of the mind. And in Germany it was a huge success, a tremendous success. And in some ways I think what I would really love to hear, what fascinated you about this figure of Hannah Arendt, and that in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Brazil, in Argentina, and to a very different degree in Israel, Hannah Arendt still symbolizes something, a certain kind of independence of thinking. And I think what she also did in the Eichmann book, she actually dismantled the phantasmagorical fantasy of the all-powerful Nazi beast, which Israeli literature has tried to dismantle. So she took away the hold and the kind of fascination of these monstrous beings to say we can defeat this by analyzing what happened here. The Origin of Totalitarianism was a very important book because there was a sense this is undefeatable. It's just pure horror and you can't talk about it or you have to be silent. So she said, I will not listen to this. I won't be silenced in the wrong way. Maybe there's a moment to be silent, to commemorate and to be respectful. And she said, that kind of respect I don't have time for. She was a very impatient person. She has a very famous anecdote. She was at Yale University in 1969. Someone asked a question and she said, next. And she could not be bothered. She thought, stupid things are not worth talking about. The world is too urgent for us. We won't do that here, so. But I think I would be curious to hear what you, or the editor James Atlas, what you think. What captivated you about this life? Because she really still excites people. And what is it? It's also, Julia Kristeva said, she's one of the rare women geniuses in the world. She's a woman and a thinker who is very independent. I think that's very important for a lot of people. Don't you think that's an added dimension to this?
I do. I agree entirely. Yes, that's one of the things that's fascinating about her.
Yes, I've been trying to remember. Thank you. I've been trying to remember that quote, that wonderful quote about her assertion of independence, but I can't exactly. Maybe you can. But that's one of the things that fascinated me about her, was the sense of not her unwillingness to go along, which of course is what made Eichmann such an anathema to her. And also, I read Totalitarianism, and have we mentioned The Human Condition? These books I read when in adolescence that had just such tremendous sweep. I mean, she was one of the few intellectuals who could really grapple with the entirety of Western civilization.
Jim, could you hand your microphone to the man in front of you in red? He's been waiting. Go.
No, I wouldn't have asked this question, or it wouldn't have come to me, but hadn't mentioned that you had written a biography of Ayn Rand. And, well, Ayn Rand was affected by her background in the Soviet Union.
Indeed.
She was strong-willed, stubborn. I mean, a lot of the characteristics, if you get away from the intellectual substance, but a lot of the characteristics are very similar.
These two women are the only women I can think of who were born and died under the arc of European fascism, and who devoted their lives to in very different ways to dismantling and fighting it. So it is interesting. Yes, it is. Also, yes, stubborn. Much less. She had much less charm than Hannah Arendt did, I must say.
I have to mention, in the early 60s, Ayn Rand was recommending Hannah Arendt's book on totalitarianism.
I didn't know that.
Interesting. We have time for one or two more questions. Yes, here.
And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the process of writing a short biography. Arendt was enormously prolific during her lifetime. She published several books posthumously, and in the nearly 40 years since her death, there's been an explosion of secondary literature. Yet your book is really, I thought, quite succinct and, as others have said, really eloquent in, painting a sharp narrative of her life. So I was wondering if you could just talk about how you, blocked out everything to keep it to be a really tight life.
The nature of my interest in Hannah Arendt, the deepest interest I had in her at the time I was writing the book, was her willingness to be in contradiction, in defiance, independent, to think for herself, and to have the courage to write what she thought. And so that was my theme, and it was about that I collected as much evidence and let as many ideas adhere to that theme as I could in the space of the book. So there was lots I had to leave out that I would have loved to have written about.
I want to underline two things you said. One, that she had this incredible gift for friendship, and she actually thought friendship is something you have to work on, cultivate, think about, maintain. It wasn't just it came to her. And secondly, you said there was a very moving and beautiful passage, very complicated, about the status of the victim, and when she wrote about refugees or pariahs, it's actually deeply moving.
Moving.
I think her humor, I don't want to leave the evening without emphasizing, she was a very funny person. She's a very gifted writer, and there are moments in her writing that are deeply moving. So it's not that she lacked compassion for the world, and I also think the Heidegger affair is something that we had Sheila Beep here many years ago, great philosopher, political thinker who's written on Arendt, who was not happy to talk about Heidegger. She said, I do not want to talk about Heidegger, I want to talk about Hannah Arendt, because she's overshadowed by this, other philosopher. But she had a great capacity for love, and she was deeply in love with the men she was married to, and then a few other men as well. And she was completely capable, and I think that's actually quite important, she was completely capable of holding that in her life, to be thinking intellectual and to be a person full and gifted for love. And I think that's actually the other part that's sort of coming out, that this is something she was invested in the world. And so I think when you said that, it's something to really emphasize, because we don't want to leave and think Hannah Arendt was a...
You point out also her doctoral thesis was on Augustine's concept of love.
Yes. Well, and I want to say that the anger, almost fierce anger that you feel when reading Eichmann in Jerusalem, is anger that I think is basically anger that this happened, and that this has to be confronted, that it happened in the world. I think that's the source of her rage in that book.
It is about 7:30. By contract, we like to move into our next phase of our evening, which is our reception. We have a wonderful reception for you, and Anne will meet with you and sign books or talk with you outside. I think that's a good time for us to close. So thank you very much.